Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today we're tackling a pretty heavy topic, looking into some recent analyses suggesting the U.S. might be, well, showing signs of heading towards autocracy.
Yeah, it's definitely something that gets your attention.
And this isn't just, random speculation. We're digging into research based in political science. You, our listener, actually flagged a really interesting Scientific American piece for us, and a summary document, too.
Right, and what's key here, I think, is that these aren't just opinion pieces. They're using established academic frameworks to analyze current trends.
Exactly. So our mission, really, for this deep dive is to unpack what these sources see as the main warning signs.
To understand the potential path they're sketching out and give you a clear, concise overview. It's complicated stuff.
Definitely. We want to get to the core insights without overwhelming everyone.
Okay.
Okay, so let's dive in. The big picture concern, highlighted in that Scientific American article from last September, is that political science research is genuinely raising alarms about the U.S. potentially becoming an autocracy.
Even back then, yeah.
Yeah, even then. They flagged a specific political figure as checking, and this is a quote, all the warning boxes for an autocrat.
Wow.
Mentioning things like embracing nonsensical conspiracy fantasies, ignoring climate change, favoring unqualified ideologues.
Right, and the update from this May, the article notes, is that sadly, it, quote, all checks out. Even more so now, apparently.
It's pretty sobering. And what's striking is that it's not just one voice saying this.
No, the article points out that scholars more broadly are worried the U.S. could be heading for worse.
And they bring in a legal angle too, right?
Yeah, exactly. They quote David Pazin, a law professor at Columbia. This is back in April.
Okay.
And he described what he saw as a disregard for, core democratic principles, civil liberties, political pluralism.
Separation of powers.
Separation of powers, yeah. Legal constraints. He said these things mark an authoritarian regime.
So you have political science and law kind of converging on this concern.
That convergence really does underline the seriousness of what the sources are discussing.
So here's where it gets, well, maybe more unsettling in a way.
Yeah.
The sources suggest this isn't like a sudden coup d'etat scenario.
Right. Not usually, anyway. It's often more gradual, like a slow chipping away at democratic norms, at institutions.
They compare it to places like Turkey and Hungary.
Yeah, where democratic backsliding has been observed over time, kind of incrementally.
Which brings us to Daniel Stockmer's work. He's a political scientist at the University of Ottawa.
Right. His May report in Politics and Policy.
What's his main takeaway?
Well, his conclusion is that the U.S. has been on what he calls a slippery slope toward autocracy since a particular inauguration.
A slippery slope.
Yeah. But he emphasizes it's not about predicting, a violent takeover. It's more subtle, an incremental form of democratic erosion.
Incremental autocratization. That's the term, right?
That's the concept, yeah. Step-by-step weakening.
And this step-by-step idea, it seems, comes largely from the work of Marianne Neuer.
That's right, a political scientist from Dresden University of Technology. She studied the collapse of democracy in Venezuela over the last, quarter century, looking at how countries can shift from democratic to autocratic gradually in stages.
So Neuer provides the sort of theoretical framework.
Yeah, like a model, almost.
Yeah.
And Stockmer applies that model, that thinking, to the U.S. situation.
Suggesting a possible path based on what's happening now.
Exactly. And what's really interesting about this model is how seemingly separate events can kind of build on each other.
Creating a cumulative effect that's hard to undo.
Right. Not one big bang, but lots of smaller shifts that make autocratic behavior seem more normal.
Right. Okay, so let's look at these steps. According to Stockmer's analysis, the U.S. has supposedly already passed through the first three.
Okay, step one.
Step one, social turmoil. The sources trace this back to the Tea Party movement under Obama.
Ah.
Describing it as a time of, angry politics, backlash against minorities, immigrants, and growing distrust in institutions.
That climate of distrust seems key.
Yeah, and they also note the U.S. was downgraded by The Economist's Democracy Index, from full to flawed democracy over the last couple of decades.
That's a pretty significant external marker, isn't it? Indicates a weakening social fabric, maybe makes fertile ground for more radical politics.
Okay, then step two, a project of radical change.
Okay.
This gets compared to Hugo Chávez's populist movement in Venezuela.
Right.
And in the U.S. context, it's linked to a specific political figure's MAGA movement.
And how do the sources describe that movement?
As defending white male privileges and commanding, prime loyalty for many Republicans.
So step 2 is the rise of a powerful political force pushing for fundamental change, often with a strong leader.
Got it. And step 3,
Decisive electoral victory.
like Chavez winning in '99.
Right. And applied to the U.S., a specific election year is mentioned. And crucially, this victory also brought control of Congress.
A subservient Congress is the phrase used. That seems important, controlling multiple branches.
Absolutely. That kind of victory, especially with legislative control, gives the power and, well, the opportunity to start weakening those checks and balances.
Which leads us right to the edge of step 4, according to the analysis.
Which is?
Dismantling those checks and balances on executive power.
Ah, how so?
Well, Stockmer predicts if the trend holds, we'd see more attempts to just ignore or defy court orders.
Wow, that's a direct challenge to the rule of law.
It is. And a key tactic in this step, apparently, is using fabricated emergencies.
Fabricated emergencies, like the Red Scare is mentioned as a historical example.
Exactly. Using a manufactured crisis to justify overreach, ignore safeguards, maybe sideline the courts.
And is there a contemporary example given?
Yeah, a pretty specific one from May. A White House official suggesting they could unilaterally suspend habeas corpus.
Suspend habeas corpus. That's fundamental.
Right, to round up immigrants based on a claim of an invasion.
An invasion. But didn't the article say...
Yeah, get this. The article points out that, according to the government's own data, border crossings were actually at a historic low.
So a textbook fabricated emergency, potentially.
It certainly looks like it, based on that description.
Now, the analysis does suggest the courts would likely push back, right? Referencing the Supreme Court in 2008.
Yes.
Yeah.
It emphasizes that the crucial thing will be how the executive responds to the courts. That response is the real test of whether step 4 is fully happening.
Whether there's respect for those legal limits, okay.
Then we get warnings about steps 5 and 6. Step 5 is about securing long-term power. And the analysis mentions a specific individual, quote, musing of seeking an unconstitutional third term as president.
Directly challenging term limits.
Yeah, that fits the pattern of consolidating power beyond normal cycles.
And step 6, the final step in this model, is the infringement of basic rights and freedoms. And the source says warning signs are already there.
Apparently so.
Yeah.
It gives examples like executive orders related to the UN Human Rights Council, transgender people in the military, actions seen as privileging Christianity.
Quite a range of areas.
Yeah. And it includes a prediction of attacks on minority voting rights in future elections as part of this stage.
So potentially restricting who gets to participate to solidify power.
Yeah.
That's, yeah.
Now, there's another perspective the sources bring in, a different way to measure things.
Okay.
Using the idea of competitive authoritarianism. This comes from political scientists Levitsky, Way, and Ziblatt.
Ah, yes, competitive authoritarianism. That's where, like, elections still happen, but the playing field is tilted, right?
Exactly. And their metric, their yardstick, is actually pretty simple. What's the cost of opposing the government?
Interesting. And their conclusion?
Is that the U.S. has already crossed this line.
Really? Based on what?
They point to Department of Justice investigations into people seen as political enemies, donors to the Democratic Party, even news outlets.
Oh, which outlets?
CBS News, the Des Moines Register are mentioned specifically.
So, using state power against perceived opponents.
That's the implication. And they observe that this authoritarian offensive has had a clear impact.
How so?
Forcing Americans to, quote, think twice about their actions, suggesting a kind of chilling effect.
Yeah, that self-censorship idea is really concerning. If people feel they can't speak out or act politically without potential negative consequences.
It definitely changes the dynamic. But, okay, it's not presented as totally inevitable, right? There's some pushback possible.
Right. That's important. The sources do offer some, let's call it cautious optimism, maybe. The slide isn't guaranteed.
What could change things?
Well, they mention factors like the courts holding firm, Congress potentially listening to protesters or public opinion. They note a specific individual's decline in approval rating.
Okay.
And even the possibility of a key political coalition fracturing. It's described as big tech on one side, white nationalists on the other.
Yeah.
That kind of unlikely alliance might not hold.
So there are potential circuit breakers.
Exactly. There's still agency. Things can shift.
But there's a but.
Yeah, the but is that the damage already done might be significant and hard to reverse.
Stockmer's analogy really hits home here about how easy it is to destroy something like USI.
Right, compared to rebuilding it. Not just the buildings, but the trust.
Both domestically and internationally. They mention the, quote, rapid plummet of Canadian attitudes toward the U.S., as an example.
Yeah, that trust is fragile. His house analogy sums it up, doesn't it? I can tear down a house in a day, but it will take a year or longer to rebuild it.
It really underscores the long-term consequences of weakening these norms and institutions.
Even if the slide stops or reverses eventually.
So let's try to wrap this up, our deep dive into these sources. Well, they definitely highlight some serious warning signs about democratic health in the U.S.
And crucially, these aren't just gut feelings. They're based on, established political science models and analysis of recent events.
The picture painted is one of a gradual, incremental process, with real concerns about checks and balances, basic rights.
Yeah. But as we've said, and as the sources stress, it's not presented as a done deal. Not inevitable.
There's still room for things to change course, for these trends to potentially be reversed.
Depending on institutions, public action, political shifts, lots of variables.
Which kind of leads us to a final thought for you, the listener, to chew on.
Mm-hmm.
Thinking about all these analyses, these potential steps and warning signs, what specific actions or shifts, maybe in society, maybe in politics, do you think would be most critical? Either in, well, accelerating these trends or hopefully reversing them?
It's a big question. Definitely something worth reflecting on, maybe even digging into the sources yourself.
Absolutely. Thanks for taking this deep dive with us.